All right, well, thanks very much. You can hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. Hey, thank you for the introduction, but also thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I love Wellington, and I've only been here a day. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm just to add a very little bit more to that context. By training, I'm a population geneticist and community ecologist, and so what I'm going to share with you today is a little. Well, it's more than a little bit, but it's some of what we do in the lab. On the other half is a whole other area of research that is more field-based. And what I run is something called the Seafood Ecology Research Group, which, as the name suggests, is we deal with seafood, but as most of us are coming out of an ecological background, that's the basis of our approach. But being seafood, we also need to be aware and engage in the economic, social, political dynamics. And the way I describe it is that we sit at the interface of the limited ability of the oceans to produce and the unlimited capacity of humans to consume, and the frictions that obviously result from that. So, I'll step back here so you can see this. I'll put this slide up again at the end if you may or may not be able to see my email down here. I'm going to run through what is I'll try and make this engaging, and I will certainly not be offended if anybody wants to get up and make a step to the bar to refill. Please do at any time. I'll try and keep this fresh and engaging, but I want to relate some of the work that we've been doing, and I'm going to pose some ideas, some suggestions for what I think is an exciting opportunity for New Zealand to continue its long-standing position at the forefront of innovation. And in this case, the emerging, evolving, and increasingly contentious debate around what sustainability is, and particularly with regards to food security, food sovereignty, in particular protein. But anyways, we'll get to that in due course. So this unfortunately named thing called GAPI, we joked, oh, we'll call it GAPI, and then nobody ever changed it, and then it went to print, and now we're stuck with it. It's the Global Aquaculture Performance Index, and I'll explain what that is and get to that in a moment. I just want to recognize the fact that this work was funded through the Lenfest Ocean Program and the Pew Environment Group. And I'm from the other UVic, University of Victoria, which is in British Columbia on an island just off of Vancouver. I also wanted to make note that this is not my inspiration. This is the product of a great many number of individuals. We held expert workshops around the US and Canada, and one in Europe actually, to garner or develop some of the thinking that goes into this, and we actually faced quite a number of fairly complex and thorny problems, and these individuals and others are to be commended for their input. And finally, the GAPI is something of a mariculture or marine aquaculture application of a much larger program called EPI, so you know where GAPI came from. This is the Environmental Performance Index, and this is a joint program from Yale and Columbia universities that is a snapshot of the global ecological performance country by country, and it's presented every year at the Davos Economic Forum, and it has become the definitive quantitative assessment of sustainability and ecological performance of countries around the world. So we're, as the students earlier noted, that in their projects they were standing on the shoulders of giants, so too we in this GAPI work are standing on the shoulders of giants. Okay, so what is this? This is a simple pie diagram that represents aquaculture. There's marine aquaculture, often plants and bivalves, crustaceans. We've got freshwater aquaculture, and then this small piece is marine finfish aquaculture, which actually represents a fairly small, globally speaking, amount of production worldwide. This is where we focused. In this assessment, though, we cover 93.7% of this production. So I think it's safe to say that we've covered the global marine aquaculture production in terms of this assessment. We needed to develop a number of indicators to make these assessments. They needed to be relevant, obviously. They need to demonstrate environmental sustainability or be directly related to it. We're interested in performance. We're not interested in best practices. We're not interested in lofty goals, qualitative objectives. We're interested in what's going on the water. They need to be transparent. Everything that we do, and I'll keep reiterating this, everything we do is transparent. It's open. The raw data is available on the webpage if you care to pursue it, but also all the analyses and everything. And so this is an incredibly fractious environment in which to work. New Zealand is beginning, you're getting a taste of it. It's nothing here compared to what it's like in Canada, Chile, Europe. And that's a good thing, and you don't want to go down that road. And part of the importance, or part of the way to keep it from that, is to be completely open and transparent in all of the discussions and the material that goes into these debates. And we've done our best to be that. And obviously, we want the best quality data that we can find. Not always an easily attainable goal, however. We went out and we surveyed all of the sustainable seafood initiatives out there. There are 36 sort of globally that these are wallet cards or buyer's guides or organic certifications, etc. And we asked, well, what are the kinds of things that all of these initiatives are interested in terms of sustainable aquaculture products? And time and again, these 10 things came up. This actually says inputs up on the top. This represents almost a peer review assessment of the sustainable seafood world. These 10 things were represented again and again, no matter where you look. So in inputs, we're looking at where are the actual broodstock and production fish coming from? What's the ecological energy? In other words, how much stuff does it take to make a product that you're interested in consuming? What's the industrial energy, largely petroleum? And what's the sustainability of the feed source that's going into it? On the output side, antibiotics, anti-foulants, so things that keep the fouling down to a minimum on net pens and such. Chemical oxygen demand is our proxy for how much organic nutrients are being released into the water. Pesticide or parasiticide use. And then the two potentially most complicated things, those things that once they leave the farm environment continue to live on, to evolve, to change, and potentially become problems, escapes and pathogens. So these 10 key indicators form the basis of this work. They're certainly not the only things you could measure. WWF, World Wildlife Foundation, their salmon dialogues are looking at over 100 different indicators. So like something like, well, I don't know if you get consumers reports here, but certainly Michelin guides of restaurants, you don't need to go in and measure every last thing, hundreds of different criteria. What you're interested in are the basic key elements that are going to be able to separate leaders from laggards, and that's what this is. Right? So we're focusing on just the major key elements. These are them. I won't go into them at all. If you're really keen, again, everything is available, and all of these formulae are explained in nauseating detail on the webpage and the various documents that have resulted from this. Okay, so here's our 10 indicators. We then generate a species country score. So Chinook salmon, New Zealand. Chinook salmon, Japan. Atlantic salmon, Norway. What became very apparent early on, though, was that it made a big difference in what the scale of production was. And so simply generating a score for a country and a species wasn't enough. We needed to separate these scores out into a score per metric ton. Right? So that is, per metric ton of production, what is your ecological performance? And then, separately, what's the cumulative impact of the country's entire production? And I'll parse this out a little bit more as we go through. Each of these is generating a score. I want to make it very clear, this is not a standard. We're not drawing a line and saying above this you're sustainable, below this you're not. Right? These are not buying guides, these are not certifications. What we needed to do, though, was still be able to speak to sustainability. Some initiatives set the bar really high, right? Others set the bar quite low. What are we to do? How are we going to sort of define what we say is sustainable, or at least provide a baseline or benchmark to measure against? Well, because we're not a standard, we set a standard, or we set a baseline of 0 impact. Now, of course, any production system is going to have some impact, and that's fine. What we're saying is our metric, our score, is actually measuring how close you get to that 0 impact. Okay, so for instance, here's 2 Atlantic salmon products, one from Norway, one from Chile. Right? The Norwegian product is a little closer to that 0 impact. Right? So 0 impact on those 10 categories, right, gives a final score of 72, Chile 66. Well, that's moderately interesting. But for the first time, we can now put a whole plethora of species on a level playing field, and we can compare amberjack against salmon. We can compare any one species produced in any country against any other species produced in any other country. And that's what this report seeks to do. Now, it's not all going to be like this, I promise you. But I do need to cover these bases for the rest of it to make sense. This is a spider diagram or a radar diagram. Each of the 10 indicators are arranged out here. The line in this case is Chinook salmon produced in New Zealand. The bigger or the longer the line is coming out here, the better the score. So if New Zealand encompassed this entire area, right, that would be a score of 100. What this does, this approach though, allows us to look at, well look, antibiotics, biological oxygen demand, not an issue in New Zealand, not at all. Right? However, copper, that's a potential issue. Escapes is an issue. By approaching it this way, it makes policy relevance clear. We don't necessarily, this 73 out of 100, right? That's the top score, by the way. So if you're inclined to be proud, then feel free. But 73 is not something that I'd be proud of necessarily, or my kids bringing home. But it was the best score of the bunch, and so that should tell us something about marine mariculture in general. It also makes clear on where the low-hanging fruit is for improvement. This grayed out area, by the way, is the global average. Okay, so here's Chinook salmon. Now I've added Chile, okay, in the lighter blue. And so we can see that there's certain similarities between New Zealand and Chile, but also some fairly striking differences. Obviously, antibiotic use in Chile is a fairly significant problem, not so much in New Zealand. To show, this is the bottom of the class grouper. It's a nightmare from start to finish. What's interesting, though, is not only are these scores very low, 50 was the global average, but China and Indonesia score very low for quite different reasons. And so if we're interested in developing grouper policy, right, it's important that we differentiate, well, what are the real hindrances in each of these countries, because they're quite different. Each of these production systems vary quite dramatically. So an approach like this makes these policy relevant criteria straightforward. Now, this is something that, if this sparks any interest in you whatsoever, you can go back and look at. This is an alphabetical ranking of, or scores of all the countries that we looked at, normalized or we score per metric ton in red, the cumulative score in green. A couple of things jump out at you. First of all, scale makes a big difference. Chile and Norway, the two largest salmon producers in the world, relatively large or high normalized score. 72 for Norway, right? Only 1 point behind New Zealand, right? But very low cumulative scores. I'll come back to that in a moment. Likewise, we have the inverse. Australia, very high cumulative score, but very low normalized scores. Okay? This is telling us there are two very different profiles going on here. What they are, we'll get to in a moment. Here we've just, or I've arranged these now in just descending normalized scores, so you get a sense of, by species, in terms of who the kind of leaders of the pack are: Chinook salmon, mullet, Atlantic salmon, European sea bass, and then down on this end, groupers, red drum, sea bass, cobia, etc. Now, we can get into sort of life history dynamics and energetics of this and explain why this all is, but we won't. Okay, so here's where things hopefully start becoming a little more interesting. Here's the industry score, or the normalized score per metric ton. Okay, bad score, good score. Here's the aggregated score, the cumulative score, poor, best. Now I've arranged all of the players according to how they've scored on both the normalized and cumulative scores. A couple of interesting things jump out. Down here, this is the worst of the worst. Bad normalized, bad per metric ton, bad cumulative. What is the thread that sews all of these together? They're young. They're also tend to be Asian in origin. These industries are all around 5 years old. Aquaculture is a trial and error industry. You keep on working, trying new things. When you find something that works, that's what you build on. But it's the failures, right, that actually are the learning curve. In young industries, failures manifest as ecological problems. All of the youngest industries are the worst in both cases. The intermediate age, so we're talking in a couple of decades old, tend to score reasonably well on a per metric ton, reasonably well on a cumulative. So now we've got these intermediate aged industries that have found efficiencies, have found the right way of doing things, and are in a growth phase. And then we've got the mature industries, those that have been around for a number of decades, up to 40 or more years. Those efficiencies have now been documented, and those efficiencies have driven increased production. It's the increased production then that leads to a low cumulative score, right? High per metric ton. So when you look at salmon produced in New Zealand, well, look at salmon produced anywhere really, right? They can produce, the industry can produce salmon at a highly efficient rate, right? Very low inputs for quite decent market production. What does that do? That stimulates more production. As production increases, right, the cumulative impact, which is the only ecologically relevant metric here, right? The ecology of the ocean doesn't give a damn about your performance per metric ton. It only cares, and it only responds to your cumulative impact. It's the mature products, mature industries, that on the face of it look very efficient, look high performing, right? And those are the numbers that you'll be exposed to, particularly from pro-industry sides, but have the biggest problems from an ecological point of view, and it's simply a matter of scale. Right, and I've already reiterated the fact that we've got an Asian tiger in the aquaculture world. That is, as China particularly becomes more and more mature in terms of its approach to aquaculture, it is going to kind of restructure this whole grid as time goes on. So if you Google UVic and GAPI, you'll get all of this stuff in detail, number of publications. In North America and Europe, there has become a plethora of all of these labels that many of them are consumer facing. They're buyer's guides. The ecological literacy of the consumer in North America, and I presume in this part of the world too, and in Europe, has become increasingly sophisticated as what I call the salmon wars or the seafood wars heat up. And it's become clear that if you're going to walk into a supermarket and make an informed choice, you almost need an advanced degree. And so, as a result, there's been an industry that has arisen to try and console the consumer. Don't worry, you don't need to take a master's or a PhD in marine ecology. You just need to look for this label and it's all going to be okay. Tremendous. This is only a little snapshot of the number of labels that are out there. So there's a growth industry in there about trying to meet consumers' demands. We did a little exercise based on GAPI that asked, well, if a product is labeled with one of these certifications, what is the net benefit above and beyond the conventionally produced product? Right? What's the ecological value of these labels? Right? So if we have a conventional score of 70, right, to open net pen, just plain Jane product, but we have a labeled product, right, that actually scores an 81, the value added is 11 points. Right? This is the value of that label. Here's a selection of labels. Frankly, I'm not sure how many or what of these are actually in play in New Zealand. The interesting thing is, though, that, and here they are ranked in terms of their value added, we've got labels out there that are actually setting a bar below conventional production norms. So we were threatened with lawsuits from Marks and Spencer when we identified that the Marks and Sparks brand, the sustainability label, actually set a bar 10 points below the rest of the world conventional Atlantic salmon production. Right? And very quickly, talk of lawsuit disappeared, but change occurred. More than half of these represent no or exceedingly modest improvement over conventional products. Right? You're going to pay a premium for these, though. But they represent, in terms of performance on the water, almost no significant improvement. The only ones up here, Australia Certified Organic represents a 15-point improvement. But we're starting out from down at the bottom. Australian aquaculture is characterized by the most problematic and beastly of critters. Right? And so even with an improvement of 15 points, they're still only sitting at a 62. It's a marked improvement, but it's not somewhere that I think anybody is going to say, okay, that's good, you're good enough. The U.S. organic standards, there's not a fish farmer out there, conventional product anyway, that says that we can actually come anywhere close to meeting these. And so the U.S. organic standards, while they're not actually invoked yet, are probably not going to be met, and they'll become sort of a vapor standard. And so what are we going to do? Right? We have this tremendous input. Millions, tens of millions of dollars have been put into messaging, into effort in developing all of these labels, and they're delivering very modest returns on that investment. A couple of things bubble up from all of this. There's lack of strong and measurable performance-based standards. Many of these standards set best practices, which again, have a place, but it's almost impossible to actually assess them, right? Or they have qualitative standards, or are simply vapor standards, right? We're going to try not to screw things up too badly. Performance needs to be measured. There's a tremendous amount of investment that's gone into the sustainable seafood movement, right? Including New Zealand, Australia, and elsewhere, and that investment is growing over time. It's my observation that the return on that investment continues to be, or failed to be assessed. What movement is actually happening out here? And I would argue the biggest challenge is that of scale. And this is an important issue, particularly in New Zealand right now, as you're going through a very vigorous debate around scale, and particularly with your Chinook salmon industry. Right? How big is too big? How much is enough? This issue, or the lack of discussion of this issue, is not just in New Zealand. It, in fact, is lacking across the entire seafood world. Case in point, the 72 points scored by Norwegian Atlantic salmon. Well, people look at that and they say, or 73, by New Zealand, and the pro people will look at it and say, well, look at that, we're doing pretty damn well. That's terrific. Well, but that's the per metric ton. Nobody cares. That's good. If you're a farmer, you care, because that means that your balance sheet is looking good. You're getting good product per amount of input, right? But if you're interested in the ecology, it's irrelevant. Norway scores a 33 when we take into account the 736,000 metric tons that are produced every year. This represents the weight on the Norwegian ecology. And so if we're going to talk about relative, or the importance of sustainability and how sustainable something is or isn't, right? We don't care about this. This is the number we care about. Yeah, I was afraid this was going to happen. Well, if it was a little bit darker in here, let me set the stage. This is a screenshot, or an aerial shot of coastal Japan, and it looks brilliant on my computer. It is a plethora of, just imagine a sea of thousands of fish farms in this area. Yeah, thanks, but still not happening. And then there's a farm. There actually is a farm. I feel I should be miming this, right? This is the farm that's certified organic, certified sustainable, certified whatever, right? That's great, but it's surrounded by 1,000 other farms. Do we really care that this farm is certified? So into this increasingly complex situation, we've now got a suite of technologies that are known as recirculating aquaculture systems, or RAS. And RAS systems are just as what they sound. These are completely contained aquaculture systems that are being developed mostly for salmon. Other species are being brought online. They produce between 1 to 5 metric tons per year per farm. Now, to put that into context, New Zealand production is somewhere in the neighborhood between 12 and 13 metric tons. All right, this is one farm. Sorry, 1 to 5. That should be 1 to 5,000 metric tons. 12,000 metric tons in New Zealand. These systems, and there's a really interesting system that's being, this is Port, oh, let me back up. Victoria, where I'm from, there's Vancouver, Seattle's down here, this is Vancouver Island, up here is Port McNeill. Our First Nations, our Indian community in Port McNeill is actually developing one of these RAS systems in collaboration with a group, Save Our Salmon, and being funded in part by Tides Canada, which is a completely recirc closed system. Picture of its development. These are biosecure, right? There's no pest issues, there's no disease issues incoming, coming out. Right? There's up to 100% recirc systems. This one is, as I understand it, not quite there yet, but there are systems in Eastern Canada and elsewhere that are 100% recirc. In other words, the water that goes in at the start of the production cycle is the same water that's in there at the end, completely closed off from the natural environment. These can be, in salmon, are being raised in freshwater, in brackish, which is a mix of fresh and marine, and full marine. Grow out is very quick, between 12 and 15 months. Right? There's no chemicals used in these systems. Right? There's no antibiotics, there's no therapeutants, there's no antifoulants, nothing. And the carbon footprint is dramatically reduced. Now people look at this, well, you know, the pumps, all the water, you know, that's a tremendous increase in energy use. Over conventional net pens, yes. But 85 to 90% of the carbon footprint of seafood, particularly fresh aquaculture seafood, is in transport. So because now we're divorcing the farms from the sea, these farms can be moved and put into communities where the product is being consumed, eliminating, effectively, transportation, which is by far and away the biggest carbon emitter in the whole process. Without going into a lot of detail, these production systems eliminate or answer all of the excuses that I have heard over the last 15 years from the conventional net pen producers in British Columbia and around the world. Well, we can't because of this, because of that, and so on. It's the cost of doing business. Well, a group, and an increasingly large group of individuals around the world are showing that actually, no, you can do it. And you can produce salmon with exceptionally high ecological scores and do it economically with economic viability. The last point I want to make is that so far I've been talking about this fish, this salmon versus that salmon, this grouper versus that bass. That's really interesting to people like me. It may or may not be interesting to people like you. It's sure as hell not interesting to the average consumer. Now, these are North American data. I presume that, you know, the pie looks somewhat similar here in New Zealand and elsewhere. This is, in pounds, annual consumption of an average American consumer. So 82 pounds of chicken, 48 of pork, 60 of beef, 12 of fish. And that's fish, wild-caught, aquaculture, crustaceans, seafood writ large. So when we engage in these debates about, well, my fish is better than your fish, and you should be eating this fish and not that fish, right? We're talking about this tiny little piece of the pie. And to the average consumer, it's just noise. It's noise. Actually, it's noise to me a lot of the time too, right? If we're going to engage in a discussion around sustainability, we need to move away from this fish versus that fish and expand this argument into something that is relevant to the consumer. For every kilo of seafood consumed, right, there's 16 kilos of terrestrial animal protein consumed. We need to move away and put fish on a continuum of all animal protein. Right? Move away from the fish versus fish and towards something that's more relevant. Right? Bring these two things together. I guarantee you nothing will move consumers towards sustainable seafood faster than a clear, quantitative, easily, excuse the pun, digestible assessment of the ecological performance of the beef, the chicken, the pork, and the fish that they're likely to consume. Right? Not only will we have more seafood consumers, we'll have more sustainable seafood consumers, right? And it will interject a level of reality into the sustainable food initiative or argument. Right? So what I'm arguing for is we need a quantitative performance base. Again, we need to base this on performance on the ground in the water. Right? What are the impacts and the benefits, right, of particular production systems in particular countries? And move away from this silo of seafood that we consider separate from the silo of animal protein. We need to assess these things not only on ecological bounds, right, but economic, both in terms of community economics and national economics. And importantly, we need to introduce health metrics into this debate. Right? As I've sat as an observer in the proceedings earlier today, you know, obesity, general food security, food sovereignty, are major issues in New Zealand as they are everywhere in the world. Right? Having a level playing field, right, that we compare these various animal protein products, not just in terms of their ecological performance, but these other metrics that are equally and perhaps, looking at it from a certain perspective, more important, is absolutely necessary before we even begin to talk about, well, how are we going to build demonstrably fair and productive policy? Right now, it's a vacuum. You can't. Pretty much. I'm going to skip passes. It's my observation that the terrestrial animal protein is both limited in two ways. It's innovation limited. Right? You can only make so much pork per acre. Right? We can introduce transgenics and we can tweak things that way. But in terms of conventional production, we're up against a wall. Right? We're also innovation limited in the sense, or sorry, growth limited in that there's no room to grow. Right? I've driven across, much of the South Island, New Zealand, and looked at a lot of agricultural parts around the world. Right? We can't absorb or appropriate any more area. Right? What we need to do is make better use of the areas we've already appropriated. And this is where aquaculture really has an opportunity to shine. What's interesting is that we did a little quick sort of back of the envelope assessment, and we looked at some of the major American labels that are supposed to console the consumer, that relax, it's okay, this is a good product that you're consuming. We did it in a very similar way. We did a quick sort of overview of what are the major issues in terrestrial agriculture meat production. Right? These are them. And then we asked, well, how well are these things being evaluated? It turns out that because so much scrutiny has gone into seafood labels, right? As soon as anybody stands up and says, that salmon is good or bad or otherwise, they are immediately jumped on by lawyers and well-meaning and bad-meaning individuals and groups and NGOs, and every little nuance of a discussion is torn apart and evaluated. And while that certainly has, it's not a great environment to be in all the time, what it's done is produced a suite of some of the best labels out there are actually really robust. And in fact, do a better job, seafood labels do a better job of evaluating terrestrial products than the terrestrial labels do themselves. Largely because nobody's looking at this. Nobody knows what goes into a sustainable steak, a sustainable pork chop, or a chicken cutlet. Nobody has the faintest idea, and frankly, I don't think that many people care at this point. But for some reason, they do care about whether their salmon steak is sustainable or the shrimp that they're eating was produced in a sustainable way. If we can take that literacy and increase sensitivity and then leverage that and bring the rest of the animal protein world into that conversation, we will greatly accelerate this discussion around sustainable food, is my estimation. And our preliminary analysis shows that seafood in general, particularly sustainable aquaculture and particularly RAS aquaculture, will look very, very appealing next to even the most arguably sustainable steak or pork chop out there. And that's a discussion worth having, and it has the potential to actually engage consumers in a way that they haven't been engaged before. And I think any discussion is good. So, I'll end it there. I've given you quite a bit, and my email is down here. If you want to, feel free, please contact me. If you want to follow up on anything I've talked about, it's all available from the SERG website. And I don't think nearly enough of you have gone to the bar yet, so I think you should go now. Thanks.